When thinking about going through this nugget with you, I was thinking, how can we set up some limits and reservations and make it really easy to replicate in a lab environment so you can get your hands-on practice and see it in action? So here's what we can do. Let's set up a CPU reservation at the VM level for a virtual machine. And for that reservation, let's go ahead and guarantee the virtual machine 2 gigahertz of CPU. And we could also spell that as 2,000 megabytes of CPU. It's all the same to vSphere. And then on another VM, let's go ahead and set up a CPU limit where even if there's plenty of resources, it won't matter to this VM because we'll go ahead and give it a 1 gigahertz CPU limit. So we'll do some cloning to create a couple new VMs. We'll set those parameters regarding the reservation and limits for CPU, and then we'll power them on and take a look at the result. Our first order of business is to create a couple of VMs that we can go ahead and tweak the limits and reservations for regarding CPU. So to do that, let's go ahead and right-click on VM-1. And from the action menu for VM1, let's go ahead and hover over Clone. And from the sub-menu, let's click Clone to Virtual Machine. And let's call this first one VM_CPU-limit. And we'll go ahead and open up the data center. And we'll drop that VM in the VMs folder and click on Next. And we have a couple of clusters to choose from, so we'll put them in cluster 2. We'll let DRS sort out which ESXi host will have the privilege of running that VM, and then we'll click on Next. As far as the data store, even though we're doing a clone and the source is thin provisioned, I'd like to err on the side of caution, and I'm going to select thin provisioned here, and we'll use the iSCSI network-based data store for this virtual machine, and click Next. I'm going to leave all these blank. I'm not going to power on the virtual machine because we want to go in and tweak the parameters of that VM before we power it up. So we'll click on Next and then click on Finish, and we're 1 down, 1 to go. So let's create one more virtual machine, one that we'll set up with a CPU reservation. So we'll right click on VM-1. From the action menu for VM1, we'll hover over Clone, and then from the sub menu, click on Clone to Virtual Machine. We'll name this one VM_CPU-reservation. Let's open up the Las Vegas data center, and we'll select the VMs folder as a home for this virtual machine and click on Next. We'll put this also in cluster 2 by selecting cluster 2 and clicking on Next. We'll choose thin provisioning, and we'll also put this guy on the iSCSI data store and click on Next. And then I'm not going to power this one on either initially, so we'll click on Next and click on Finish. Great. And then what we can do is click on the recent tasks in the bottom left there, and here it is chugging away as it creates those virtual machines. So we'll let that go ahead and finish, and then once it's completely done, we'll go ahead and configure the virtual hardware on those 2 VMs with the appropriate CPU limit or reservation depending on the virtual machine we're working with. And actually, while that completes, let's do one other thing. Let's go ahead and just create a little bit of organization so it'll be really easy to go ahead and find these VMs. So let's go ahead and click on the VMs and Templates tab right here. And let's create a new folder, and we can create a folder within a folder. So in the VMs folder, we'll right click on VMs, and from the Actions menu, let's say we want to create a new folder, and we'll call this VMs with limits or restrictions, and click OK. And let's check real quick in the recent tasks. Great, so both VMs are currently created. Fantastic. Let's go ahead and drag and drop them into this folder called VMs with limits or restrictions. So we'll start by clicking and dragging VM_CPU-limit and drop it onto that folder, the one we just created. And we'll do the same thing for VM_CPU-reservation, and we'll drag and drop that into the folder as well. And then if we expand that folder, there they are. Fantastic. So let's go ahead and configure each of these. Now, there's several ways we can go about getting to the configuration page regarding these virtual machines. Number one, we could click on the virtual machine itself. That's certainly an option. And then click on the Configure tab, and then click on the VM hardware under Settings. And then from here, go ahead in the upper right and click Edit, and that would open up the Edit window so we can edit the properties for this virtual machine. And since we're here, we'll go ahead and do exactly that. So because this is the CPU limit virtual machine, we're going to place a CPU limit. So we'll go ahead and expand the CPU section. And just as a reminder, reservations are guarantees of minimums, limits are ceilings, and we use shares when we have contention and there's not enough resources to go around. Shares determine the proportional allotment of how much resources a device can get when there's contention for scarce resources. So in this case, we're just going to set a CPU limit right here. So across from limit, we'll go ahead and type in 1000 megahertz, which is a 1 gigahertz limit. We could also put in a 1 in that field, and from the drop down choose gigahertz, and it would mean the same thing. So if we click on OK, we've now just set a 1000 megahertz limit that this VM can get from an ESXi host. Next, let's configure the other VM with a CPU reservation. So to configure it, we could click on it, and because we were just under the configure and VM hardware, that's where it takes us for this new VM. And again, to get here, whether we right click on the VM and click on edit settings, or we go to this pane right here and we click on edit, it'll take us to the configuration for that VM. So if we click edit settings here, just to confirm that, this is the equivalent of going to this page and clicking on edit. However, I want to share with you one other option as well, because it could save you a few moments as well. And that's this. If we want to modify the reservations or the limits, what we could do is right click on the virtual machine, and there's a separate item right here. It's like a special area we can go to configure the resource settings. So if we click on edit resource settings for that VM, it takes us up to a special window, and from here we can configure CPU or memory regarding the reservations, limits, or shares. And on this VM, we want to go ahead and configure a CPU reservation, and we're going to specify a 2000 megahertz or 2 gigahertz CPU reservation for this VM. And we'll click on OK. So now that those are done, let's go ahead and click on this folder called VMs with Limits or Restrictions. And then on the VMs tab here, we've got this column here that's going to show us the utilization. And if we wanted to customize any of this output, we could right click on the header and we could add or remove columns. We could drag columns to the left or to the right to get them to look exactly the way you want them to look. So we want to power on these machines. So with the CPU-limit highlighted, I'm going to hold down the control key and click on the second one, so they're both highlighted. And then we'll click on the power on icon. And that'll power on both of the virtual machines. And while those are powering on, let me take you back to the hosts and clusters view right here. And let's click on cluster 2. And let me show you where we could go to see the reservations and limits in place for all the VMs in the cluster. So with the cluster selected, we can click on monitor. And then from the buttons just below this, we can click on resource reservation. And then we can click on CPU, memory, or storage. So with CPU selected, it's currently showing us that in the cluster, we've got 20.8 gigahertz of CPU that's being provided by these resources, ESXi2 and ESXi3. It's currently showing us that we have 2 gigahertz that are currently in use regarding reservations. And that's because this VM right here, the VM_CPU-reservation, is powered on. If this machine was not powered on, it wouldn't show that 2 gigahertz as being tied up and allocated for that VM. It's also showing us, regarding the cluster, how much CPU is left for other VMs that have reservations that need to be powered on. So by default with a VM, there is no CPU reservation associated with the VM. There's only one here on this bad boy because we just set it. Also, regarding the VM called VM_CPU-limit, here's the limit of 1000 megahertz. So even if there's plenty of resources and plenty of CPU to go around, the CPU limit VM is never going to get more than 1 gigahertz. So to see the results of this, let's go ahead and I'm going to take my browser out of full screen mode. And since we're here at the cluster view, we can just click on the VMs tab. And if we want to sort these based on VMs that are powered on, we can click on the state column here, which will sort based on the powered off or powered on status. And I'm going to click again to put the 2 that are powered on at the top. And then we have over here the host CPU. I'm going to drag that column over so it's going to be very easy to see. And I'm also going to bring over the host column and put it right next to it because I like to see which host it's running on as well. So at the moment, these VMs are not doing too much other than just having to have powered on. Also, the host CPU numbers here, it's an average over a short period of time. So if you start having significant CPU utilization, it may take a minute or two for that to be reflected right here in the host CPU that's being consumed by those virtual machines. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and open up consoles to those virtual machines. So with the CPU reservation highlighted, we'll click on the icon for Open Console. And then we'll go back to the vSphere web client. And we'll highlight the CPU-limit VM. Click on Open Console. And now we've got open consoles to each of them. So with the CPU limit VM selected, let's go ahead and click on the mouse in the upper left-hand corner of that VM. And from the menu here, let's select Terminal Emulator. And let's run the little utility glx gears I want to thank Sean Powers, by the way, for giving me the recommendation. He's a Linux guru. He has some great training here at CBT Nuggets if you want to get into or learn more about Linux. And I called him and I said, hey, Sean, I need something with a nice graphical representation, something fun that's going to eat up quite a bit of CPU. And he goes, here's the trick. GLX gears. So thank you, Sean Powers. So let me go ahead and bring this over here. It's also in this window going to show how many frames per second that this virtual machine is generating as it runs this little app. So let's then go to the CPU reservation VM. We'll click on the mouse icon in the upper left-hand corner of its desktop, and then click on Terminal Emulator, and we'll run GLX gears here as well, and press Enter. And I'll move that over here. So right off the bat, as I take a look at the output here, this one's doing about 481-ish frames per second, and if we go over to the CPU limit, it's doing, it's not doing as good. It's doing like 131, 116, 118. And why is that? It's because everything about this VM, as far as CPU, is being provided by the ESXi host it's running on. And the limit that we specified for this VM is 1 gigahertz of CPU resources. So even if there's more available on the host this is running on, the host is simply not giving it up. And if we go back to the reservation VM, it's doing the most it possibly can with the resources that it has. And it has a little head start because it was guaranteed 2 gigahertz right out of the gate of CPU. And it could be using more because the reservation is just a starting point. If the ESXi host has more to give, this VM could even get more. So if we go back to the vSphere web client and we click on refresh on this cluster view with the VMs tab selected, I let it run long enough to give us a good representation of what's happening. So as of this output, the VM with the reservation is currently using close to 3 gigahertz of host CPU, and the one with the limit will never get above 1,000. And that, my friend, is how we can configure and verify the use of CPU limits and reservations in a vSphere environment. So have some fun with the lab, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.